It was Kierkegaard who perhaps put it most clearly, though the idea shows up, in other words, across several philosophical traditions, that a truly free human being isn't the one who piles up achievements, but the one who lives according to what they believe. That man fears only one thing: betraying his own convictions. He doesn't fear any of the social punishments reserved for those who dare to step out of line. He only fears disappointing himself, and in doing so, discovering that he lived a life that was never really his own. And if that beautiful idea were pushed to its absolute limit, do you think it would survive? That's exactly the test that nearly destroyed Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers who ever lived. A test that drove him, at the height of his worldwide fame, to secretly remove from his home anything that could be used against his own life, hiding it even from himself. The glow of a phone screen on your face at 2 in the morning. Traffic at a standstill. The same blank expression on the face in the car next to you. A credit card bill landing in your inbox, reminding you of a purchase that no longer means anything. Too small to matter, but that's exactly where the question lives, in those quiet gaps, not in life's big disasters. There's a word for this, worn thin from overuse. Existential emptiness. It sounds distant, academic, but it doesn't check your resume first. It shows up precisely when life looks from the outside, all figured out. A stable job, a routine other people envy, and inside, a question that won't go away. Is this really it? Is this all there is? The most honest answer is an uncomfortable one. Yes, for a lot of people, this really is all there is, because their life followed a script they never wrote themselves. School, job, house, retirement, repeated from generation to generation, without anyone stopping to ask whether it actually works. When someone finally reaches the top of that script, there's nothing waiting for them up there. And what if that isn't weakness, but clarity knocking on the door? It was exactly that kind of clarity, taken to the extreme, that nearly kept Tolstoy from surviving it. A man who wasn't poor, wasn't unknown, wasn't a failure trying to make sense of his own failure. He had everything Western culture calls complete success, and that's precisely why the question became impossible to ignore. Before any biography, before any dates, there's one image that sums it all up. At 50 years old, already recognized as one of the greatest novelists world literature had ever produced, a landowner, a titled nobleman, married, father to several children, the kind of life any self-help manual would point to as the model to follow. He spent his nights afraid of what he might be capable of doing to himself. A man who already possessed everything we're taught to want, and still couldn't find a reason to keep living. Stop for a second on that image. One of the most widely read writers on the planet, whose books still show up on any serious list of world literature, came close to ending his own story at the very moment anyone on the outside would have said he'd won at life. What kind of story is this really? A biographical curiosity, or a warning most people would rather not hear? Because if material success and public recognition couldn't shield this man from emptiness, then maybe the logic most people follow, work more, achieve more, accumulate more, is pointing in the wrong direction entirely. Before we get to that point, we need to understand where he came from. Because Tolstoy's youth had nothing spiritual or contemplative about it. He was born in 1828 into a noble Russian family and was orphaned as a child. He lost his mother at age 2 and his father at 9. He grew up among relatives, with money, land, and a name that opened doors in any salon of the Russian aristocracy. And like many young people who are handed everything too early, he spent much of his youth trying to fill some kind of void with excess. Gambling, debts piling up month after month, heavy drinking, nights he himself would later describe with shame in his personal diaries. Then came the army. He served as an officer during the Crimean War in the early 1850s, saw death up close on the battlefields at Sevastopol, and came back with stories that would become some of his first published works. Nothing in this phase suggests a philosopher in the making. It suggests a man trying to numb himself through pleasure, reputation, and adrenaline, exactly the way a lot of people still try to numb themselves today, through other substances, other screens, other forms of validation. The difference is that, for Tolstoy, The anesthetic stopped working far too soon. In 1869, after years of writing on his estate in rural Russia, Tolstoy finished War and Peace. Today, critics and literary historians consider the book one of the most complete works ever written about the human experience in times of war and domestic peace. He'd achieved something the overwhelming majority of writers never come close to reaching: instant recognition, the respect of the European intellectual elite, and the certainty that his name would go down in the history of world literature. If professional success were enough to fill a human being from the inside, the story should end right here, on a happy note. It doesn't. A few years later, between 1873 and 1877, he wrote Anna Karenina, published in installments, as was common at the time. And it's within that novel that the first crack appears, still disguised as fiction. One of the central characters, Levin, is widely recognized by biographers and scholars as an alter ego of the author himself. Levin has land, social standing, a marriage he pursued out of genuine love, and yet he lives torn, unable to accept the customs of the social world around him without question, quietly searching for something he can't even name. That's no coincidence. A writer doesn't build an entire character around that kind of restlessness by accident. He's processing, through fiction, something he still can't admit directly about his own life. There's one specific detail in the novel that only carries its full weight once you compare it to what came later. At one point, Levin starts avoiding being alone with certain objects in the house and stops going out to hunt, afraid of what he might do to himself in a moment of despair. Tolstoy wrote that scene before he lived through the exact same thing in real life. The fiction wasn't inventing some distant drama. It was warning him, without the author even realizing it yet, of what was coming. And while readers were taking in Anna Karenina as a novel about love, betrayal, and Russian society, Tolstoy was already, on the inside, stepping into territory that no literary success could resolve. Right after finishing Anna Karenina, already nearly 50 years old, at the absolute peak of his career, Tolstoy fell into what he would later call a feeling of being trapped. Not a physical prison, a mental one, where every important question hit the same wall without an answer. He stopped being able to work with the same enthusiasm as before. He stopped feeling any pleasure in the things that used to distract him, and he began asking himself, with an insistence he described as almost physical, what's the point of any of this, if I'm going to die anyway? Notice the kind of question that is not about money, not about recognition, about meaning. And meaning is the one kind of crisis that money and recognition can't buy back. That's why this story doesn't stay confined to the realm of historical curiosity. It works as a mirror. Because the question, what's the point of all this, doesn't care about century, country, or profession. It shows up just the same inside a successful executive's office as it does in the bedroom of someone still building their career. The difference is that most people push that question off for later, for when there's time, for when things settle down. Tolstoy didn't have that option. The question hit too hard to be postponed. Between 1879 and 1880, he wrote a short book called A Confession, published a few years later and even censored in Russia because of what it said about institutional religion. In that short, devastating text, he narrates his own crisis in the first person, without a filter, without trying to look strong. He writes that he looked at his own fame, his own books, his own material comfort, and saw all of it as an insufficient answer to a question none of those things had ever been built to answer. A Confession marks the exact point where Tolstoy's external life, full of achievements, stops mattering and his internal search takes over the narrative. Faced with this crisis, Tolstoy did what any educated, rational person would do. He went looking for answers where the culture of his time said they'd be. He turned to science. He turned to academic philosophy, reading thinkers like Schopenhauer, who had already tackled suffering and the meaning of existence head-on. He searched the writings of the great European rationalists for some argument that would resolve the anguish of feeling that everything ends in death. And he found brilliant explanations of how the world works, about physics, about logic, about history. None of them answered why to live. That detail matters more than it seems. Because there's a quiet trap in today's culture, the idea that enough information can resolve enough anguish, that if you read enough, study enough, understand how the mind works, how the economy works, how the universe works, the feeling of emptiness will just go away on its own. Tolstoy, one of the most well-read and cultured men of his own era, proves otherwise. Knowledge explains the world. It doesn't necessarily give you a reason to get out of bed. Swap out the names, move the century, and the underlying structure stays the same. The career someone builds through sacrifice, sleepless nights of studying, years of effort, can be their own personal war and peace, the achievement that would prove, once and for all, their own worth. And even after reaching it, the same question keeps waiting on the other side, untouched. Someone who's professionally successful, with a life that looks enviable on any social feed, might be lying awake at night asking the exact same question that tormented a Russian nobleman in the 19th century. The technology changed. The structure of the anguish didn't. Here's the point where this story stops being about a writer who died more than 100 years ago and starts being about the person watching this video right now. Because there's a turning point in Tolstoy's story that most surface-level summaries skip over, and it completely changes the direction of this reflection. It involves people who, in the eyes of the society of the time, had absolutely nothing. And it was in them that he found the first sign that maybe there was a way out. During the hardest stretch of his crisis, Tolstoy started closely observing the way of life of the peasants working his own land. Men and women with no formal education, no wealth, no public recognition of any kind, living off hard, repetitive physical labor. And yet, he noticed something that hit him hard. These people seemed to face their own death with a serenity that he, with all his fame and all his reading, couldn't reach. It wasn't ignorance. It was something else. Tolstoy came to believe the difference lay in a simple, direct faith, lived out day to day, without heavy philosophical questioning, combined with a life free of excess, free of the artificial distance that wealth and status tend to create between a person and the concrete reality of work, land, and community. The peasants hadn't solved the mystery of death, but they also weren't at constant war with it, the way Tolstoy was. It would be far too simplistic to reduce this message to give up everything and become a peasant. The correlation that really matters here is a different one, and a more uncomfortable one. The more a life fills up with things, the easier it becomes to lose sight of what actually sustains a human being from within. Material excess isn't the villain on its own. Often, it's simply a distraction that's a little too effective, one that keeps the important question from ever reaching its end. It was from that observation that Tolstoy began, in practice, to change the way he lived. He got rid of possessions. He started working the land with his own hands, something unusual for a nobleman of his standing. He began dressing like the peasants around him, in simple clothes made for labor, not for status. He started openly questioning, even in his own writing, the luxury he'd lived in his whole life. To a lot of people around him, that looked eccentric, even embarrassing. To him, it was the only way he'd found to try to align what he did on the outside with what he felt on the inside. There's a huge difference between admiring an idea and actually putting it into practice in your own routine. Tolstoy didn't stop at theory. He changed habits, changed clothes, changed his relationship with his own money. It was painful, full of relapses, but it was real. And that same gap between understanding and acting is what separates someone who just watches this kind of reflection from someone who lets it actually change something. Understanding philosophy is interesting. Practicing philosophy can change your life. That gap between knowing and doing rarely charges you in the moment. It builds up quietly, year after year, until something, an illness, a loss, a round number on the calendar, forces you to stop and count how many of those years went by on autopilot. That's exactly what happens in the story that comes next. In 1886, already living out this personal transformation, Tolstoy published a short novella called The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's the story of an ordinary civil servant, living an ordinary life, far removed from wars, aristocracies, or any major historical events, who suffers a mundane household accident and, because of it, discovers he's dying. And it's only on his deathbed, with his body already failing, that Ivan Ilyich finally sees his own life with any clarity. He realizes he followed, from start to finish, exactly what was expected of him. He studied what he was supposed to study. He got married because it was time to get married. He worked his way up the ladder, decorated his house the way his social position required, cultivated the right friendships, avoided anything that might look out of line. A whole life of correct decisions, approved of and applauded by the people around him. And lying there, feeling death approach, he asks himself whether a single one of those decisions was ever really his own. That's the cruelest moment in the book, and also the most honest one, because the answer Ivan Ilyich finds, too late to change anything, is no. He lived according to a borrowed script, applauded by the society around him, and never once stopped to ask whether that script had anything to do with who he really was on the inside. The physical pain of the illness, the book makes clear, is smaller than this other pain. The realization that an entire life might have been lived on autopilot. Now bring that question into your own real life, the one you're living today, not some characters in a Russian novel. How many of the decisions you've made so far, career, relationships, the city you live in, the way you dress, were chosen because they truly represent who you are? And how many were simply the path that caused the least friction with the people around you? That question is uncomfortable on purpose. It shouldn't be easy to answer quickly. Most people never let themselves stop long enough to actually dig into this, because digging into it hurts. Admitting that part of your own life might have been built on other people's expectations rather than your own convictions bruises the ego and scares you, because it suggests something big might need to change, maybe too late. Ivan Ilyich only got that clarity in the very last chapter of his existence. The question that remains is simple and heavy at the same time. Why wait that long? Tolstoy's answer to that question wasn't abstract. In 1894, he published The Kingdom of God is Within You, a book that argues for something very specific, a life guided by simple ethical principles, non-violence, radical honesty, refusal of artificial hierarchies of power, without depending on religious institutions or social structures to validate those choices. It's an ethic that comes from within, not from rules imposed from outside, a way of living that doesn't require performance, that doesn't require putting on a show for others. That particular book had an effect that reaches far beyond 19th century Russia. Decades later, a young Indian lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi read The Kingdom of God is Within You and described, in letters and in his own autobiography, the profound impact that reading had on the way he thought about resistance and non-violence. Gandhi even corresponded directly with Tolstoy during the Russian writer's final years. An idea born out of the personal crisis of a man who nearly destroyed himself from emptiness ended up influencing, decades later, one of the most important political movements in modern history. That completely changes the weight of this story, because it shows that Tolstoy's search didn't end in empty contemplation, with an isolated man philosophizing alone while the world moved on without him. It turned into concrete action, with real, measurable, historical consequences. The question, am I living out of conviction or out of convention, isn't just some comfortable mental exercise. It can change the course of an entire life and, in rare cases, the course of movements that cross continents. But before we get to the end of this story, there's a part that most quick summaries of Tolstoy prefer to skip, because it isn't pretty, isn't inspiring, and doesn't wrap up neatly with a punchy line. It's the part where he discovers, in the hardest way possible, that knowing what's right and actually managing to live by it are two completely different things. There are people who know, with perfect rational clarity, that their current job is draining their mental health, but they stay anyway because switching careers at 35 or 40 feels like too big a risk, almost a sign of failure in the eyes of anyone watching from outside. The knowledge of their own limit has been there for a while. What's missing is the courage to act on it. That's exactly the gap that separated the Tolstoy, who wrote about simplicity, from the Tolstoy, who still lived surrounded by luxury, unable, for a long time, to let go of the very comfort he criticized in his own writing. That same gap shows up in anyone who perfectly understands that performing an edited version of their own life on social media feeds constant anxiety and comparison, and yet keeps producing that edited version anyway, because stopping would create an uncomfortable silence, the sense of disappearing, of losing relevance. Tolstoy understood that mechanism before any social network ever existed, questioning in his own writing how much social appearance weighed more than it should in the decisions of the people around him, including his own. And it shows up again, even more quietly, in anyone who knows a relationship, a friendship, or a family routine is being kept alive more out of habit and fear of change than out of real connection, and who stays in it anyway, because taking it apart would feel like a betrayal of years spent together. What kind of force is that? Capable of seeing the truth and still not changing anything? Maybe it's just the most common human condition there is. Tolstoy didn't escape it. He just had the unusual courage to document that struggle in detail, without hiding his own contradictions, which makes him a far more honest case study than any self-help guru willing to sell only the resolved version of their own story. That honesty came with a concrete institutional price. In 1901, the Russian Orthodox Church formally excommunicated Tolstoy, considering his religious ideas incompatible with official doctrine. He didn't publicly walk back his own positions to reconcile with the institution. He kept writing, kept defending a personal ethic that didn't depend on institutional approval to exist. That cost him socially, even for a man already famous worldwide. And yet, the biggest conflict of his life wasn't with the church, nor with the Russian government, which also watched his writings with suspicion. It was at home. Tolstoy had been married to Sofia Tolstaya, known as Sonia, since 1862. They had 13 children over the course of the marriage, and for decades she was, beyond being his wife, a crucial collaborator in his literary work. She copied entire manuscripts by hand, sometimes more than once, ran the family estate, raised the children while he buried himself first in his books and later in his spiritual crisis. The marriage wasn't simple, no decades-long marriage is. But there was a real partnership there, built on genuine mutual effort. The problem showed up when Tolstoy's convictions, after his existential crisis, started colliding directly with that family's material structure. He wanted to give up the copyright on his own works, making them public domain, so they'd stop generating personal profit. He wanted to distribute part of the estate's land among the peasants who worked it. To him, this was consistency, living according to everything he'd been writing about simplicity and rejecting material excess. To Sonia, responsible for supporting 13 children and grandchildren, it represented real financial risk, not some abstract philosophical exercise. The tension got worse with the presence of Vladimir Chertkov, a close disciple of Tolstoy's, who gained growing influence over the writer's decisions, including control over his personal diaries and manuscripts. Sonia saw Chertkov as a direct threat to her own family, competing not just for intellectual influence over her husband, but for literal control over the written legacy that would support the children after his death. The fights at home became constant, documented in both of their diaries, each recording their own version of the conflict. A dispute that today feels painfully human. Two legitimate points of view, impossible to reconcile, under the same roof. Here's the most uncomfortable detail in this entire story. The man who spent years writing about living with internal consistency, about rejecting excess, about radical honesty, couldn't fully apply those principles inside his own home without causing real suffering to the people he loved. That doesn't invalidate his search. It makes it more real. Total consistency, with zero friction, zero collateral pain, is a fantasy from an idealized biography. The real life of anyone trying to change direction after decades of living another way comes packed with this kind of friction. In the early hours of October 28, 1910, already 82 years old, Tolstoy made a decision he'd been putting off for years. He got up before dawn, woke the personal physician who lived on the estate and his youngest daughter, Alexandra, who supported his convictions, and left the house in secret without saying goodbye to Sonia. Was it a coward's escape? His own letters, left behind, tell a different story. That of a desperate attempt to finally live, in his last years, according to what he believed was right, away from the constant tension his home life had become. The plan was simple: reach a monastery where one of his sisters lived as a nun, and maybe keep traveling from there, with no fixed destination, just searching for peace. He never made it. Still on the train, he came down with severe pneumonia and had to get off at a small, nearly unknown station called Astapovo. The station master gave up his own house so Tolstoy could rest and be treated. What happened next is one of the most ironic episodes in literary history. The man who'd spent his final years trying to escape public attention, refusing luxury, refusing the spotlight, died surrounded by journalists from several countries who camped outside the small station house, turning his final days into international media coverage, one of the first truly global press events in history. Sonia, informed of the situation, rushed to reach him, but for a long time she was kept outside by decision of Chertkov and the children closest to their father's convictions, afraid her presence would agitate a man already so fragile. She only managed to get into the room once he was practically unconscious, too late for any verbal reconciliation. Leo Tolstoy died on November 20th, 1910, at Astapovo station, far from home, surrounded by strangers, doctors, and cameras, while the wife he'd lived with for nearly 50 years waited outside a closed door. There's no more symbolic ending for a life devoted to seeking consistency between conviction and action. Even in death, the conflict between who he wanted to be and the real relationships he'd built went unresolved. No easy answer, no movie script redemption. But how did a man who nearly destroyed himself from the inside manage, even if late, to finally walk out his own front door? The answer is hidden in a habit he'd carried since he was 20 years old. A habit that, at first glance, looks like the exact opposite of everything that came after. There's a detail from Tolstoy's youth that only makes full sense in hindsight, once you know the rest of the story. Even as a young man, in his early 20s, he already had the habit of writing, in his personal diaries, detailed lists of self-discipline rules, wake-up times, reading goals, behavioral restrictions, physical and moral objectives he set out to meet. Decades before his existential crisis, he was already trying to fix himself through structure, through rules, through external control over his own behavior. It's a pattern anyone used to planners, productivity goals, and self-improvement routines will recognize immediately. And that's exactly where the quietest lesson of this entire story lives. Rules of behavior can change what a person does. They rarely change what a person feels, on the inside, about why they're doing it. Tolstoy spent a good chunk of his life trying to optimize himself through external discipline, exactly the way today's culture constantly encourages. And it was only when he stopped trying to fix himself and started asking, with brutal honesty, why he was doing any of it in the first place, that the crisis actually began moving towards somewhere new. Productivity without direction is, deep down, just a more efficient way of running from the question. Go back for a moment to that scene from the beginning. The glow of a phone screen on your face in the middle of the night, traffic at a standstill, a bill landing in your inbox. The real problem isn't in those things. It's in how much of your life can slip by inside them without the underlying question ever getting asked. Not even once. Is what I'm doing right now, this whole routine I'm keeping up, mine, chosen out of conviction? Or is it just the path that created the least friction with the people around me? It took Tolstoy 50 years, worldwide fame, and a crisis that nearly destroyed him from within before he let himself ask that question out loud. The advantage for whoever is watching this video today is simple. You don't have to wait that long. The practical invitation this whole story leaves behind isn't to walk out of your house in the middle of the night, or give up everything you've built, or become a peasant. That kind of radical gesture worked in an imperfect and painful way for one specific man, in one specific set of circumstances, and trying to copy the gesture without understanding the reason behind it is exactly the kind of mistake that turns inspiration into hollow imitation. The real invitation is smaller, quieter, and precisely because of that, harder to ignore. Pick, this very week, a single area of your life and ask Ivan Ilyitch's question before it's too late to answer it. Start with work, if that's where the doubt weighs heaviest. Stop some morning before you open your laptop and ask yourself honestly whether the career you're building represents something you'd choose again, knowing what you know now, or whether it's just the continuation of a decision made years ago out of family pressure, fear of financial instability, or lack of a clear alternative at the time. You don't have to quit tomorrow. You have to first admit the real answer, even if it's uncomfortable. If the doubt weighs heaviest on your relationships, pick one specific friendship or relationship and ask whether that bond still exists because of real connection or because of accumulated habit, out of fear of the emptiness that would take its place. Sonia and Tolstoy stayed together for almost 50 years, with genuine love and also genuine resentment. And the lesson that remains isn't that long relationships are a prison. It's that no bond truly survives unless both people involved keep choosing it consciously instead of just sustaining it out of inertia. If the doubt weighs heaviest on your own routine, on the small habits that fill up every day, look at the time spent on automatic distraction, screen after screen, without even remembering afterward what you consumed, and ask what that time would be doing for you if it were redirected toward anything that actually mattered. Tolstoy traded luxury for simple manual labor and felt in that trade something no amount of comfort had ever been able to give him, the sense that his own hands were doing something real, tied directly to his own survival and to the survival of the people around him, with no layers of abstraction in between. None of these questions has an easy answer, and none of them should. Their value isn't in solving everything in a single afternoon of reflection. It's in breaking the autopilot long enough for a conscious choice to become possible again. Ivan Ilyich only got that clarity while dying. Tolstoy only found the courage to act on it after nearly destroying himself from within. The person watching this video right now still has time, and time, contrary to what our culture of urgency makes it seem, isn't the same thing as pressure. It's opportunity, still open, to choose again. Tolstoy wasn't the first man in history to run into this same wall, and he knew it. In A Confession, he himself turns to ancient examples to make sense of his own pain, like someone looking for company in a suffering that felt too isolating to be real. He cites King Solomon in the biblical book of Ecclesiastes, writing, at the height of all the wealth and wisdom a man could accumulate, that it was all vanity, a chasing after the wind. A king with nearly unlimited power arriving at the same empty conclusion as a 19th century Russian writer. Accumulating doesn't answer the underlying question. He also turns to the legend of the Buddha, still Prince Siddhartha at the time, sheltered by his father within the palace walls, far from any suffering, until the day he went out and saw for the first time in his life an old man, a sick man, and a dead man. From that encounter on, no amount of luxury inside the palace could give him back the sense that life made sense without confronting those questions head-on. Tolstoy uses that story as a mirror of his own experience. He too had lived in a way inside the protected walls of his own success until the question about death and the meaning of existence broke through that protection. The pattern repeats itself in a way that's almost unsettling. It's so consistent. A biblical king, an Indian prince who would become the Buddha, a 19th century Russian nobleman. Different eras, different cultures, different religions, and the same crisis structure showing up every time a life reaches enough material security that the distraction of mere survival stops taking up all the available mental space. That suggests something worth taking seriously. Maybe this question isn't some rare flaw, an isolated psychological problem affecting a few overly sensitive people. Maybe it's simply what's left over once the surface of life stops being able to hide what's underneath it. Is there any explanation, beyond philosophy, for this endless cycle of achieving something and immediately missing something else? Modern science, decades after Tolstoy's death, found a technical name for part of this phenomenon. In 1971, psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell described what they called the hedonic treadmill, the human tendency to quickly return to a stable level of satisfaction, no matter how good or bad a recent external change might be. Later studies, including research on lottery winners, showed that the happiness boost after a major financial win tends to last much less time than intuition suggests before the person settles back close to their previous emotional baseline. The human brain adapts. And once it's adapted, it starts looking for the next thing. That explains, in more technical terms, exactly what Tolstoy lived through firsthand without having that vocabulary available. Every achievement, war and peace, international recognition, inherited wealth, gave him a momentary spike of satisfaction, followed by an inevitable return to the same underlying emptiness, except now with fewer excuses available to explain why he still felt like something was missing. If he'd been poor and unknown, he could have blamed the poverty and the anonymity. Being rich and famous, that exit no longer existed, and the question stood exposed, with nowhere left to run. Decades later, Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a survivor of concentration camps during World War II, arrived at a conclusion that speaks directly to this same story, even though he got there through a completely different and far more brutal path. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, published in 1946, Frankl observed that even under the most inhumane conditions imaginable, inside the camps, the people who managed to identify some kind of purpose, no matter how small, had a better chance of surviving psychologically than those who had completely lost any internal reason to keep going. His conclusion was direct. At the core, human beings aren't driven by the pursuit of pleasure. They're driven by the pursuit of meaning. And when meaning disappears, no amount of material comfort can fill that particular hole. Tolstoy lived that same truth decades before there was any scientific vocabulary to name it. Frankl lived it under conditions of extreme suffering, and still arrived at practically the same conclusion a Russian nobleman surrounded by material comfort had reached by the opposite path. Extreme wealth on one side, extreme deprivation on the other, and the same discovery waiting in both cases. Meaning isn't some optional luxury of human existence. It's the minimum structure required for anything else, pleasure, achievement, relationships, to actually make a difference. The trail these ideas left in history is bigger than most people realize. Gandhi, already influenced by "the kingdom of God is within you," carried Tolstoy's principles of non-violence into India's independence movement decades later. And Gandhi himself, in turn, would become a direct reference point for Martin Luther King Jr., who explicitly studied Indian nonviolent resistance while building the strategy of the American civil rights movement. There's a straight line, documented by historians, connecting the personal crisis of a Russian nobleman, alone in his room trying to understand why he should keep living, all the way to movements that reshaped the political map of two different continents. There's another example too, less well known but just as revealing. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, considered one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, carried a small Tolstoy book, The Gospel in Brief, during his time serving as a soldier in World War I. According to biographers, reading that text over and over in the trenches amid the constant risk of death had a direct impact on how Wittgenstein came to think about language, meaning, and existence in the years that followed. A book born out of the personal crisis of a man who nearly gave up on his own life ended up, decades later, helping another man get through the most dangerous moment of his own. None of this erases Tolstoy's contradictions. He remained until the end, a man full of flaws, unable to fully live up to his own ideals, caught up in domestic conflicts that never found a clean resolution. But maybe that's exactly why his story works so well as a mirror. He's not some distant, untouchable saint, easy to admire without recognizing yourself in him. He's an imperfect man who asked the right question, lived through the discomfort of it without any anesthesia, and, even without resolving everything, left behind a trail of ideas that kept helping people long after his lonely death at some random train station. There's a side effect of this kind of search worth mentioning before anyone decides to take it on seriously. Not everyone around you is going to applaud. Sonia didn't resist Tolstoy's changes because she was some villain in the story. She resisted because his transformation directly threatened the stability she'd spent decades helping to build. That repeats itself on a smaller scale, in any real life. When someone starts questioning their own routine, their own job, their own relationships, that forces the people around them, even unintentionally, to confront their own choices too. And confronting your own choices is uncomfortable for pretty much everyone. That's why the pursuit of internal consistency is rarely met with celebration. Sometimes it comes with confusion from friends who preferred the previous, more predictable version of you. Sometimes it comes with direct resistance from family members who depend, financially or emotionally, on the old structure. Knowing that in advance isn't a reason to give up before you start. It's a reason to understand that when other people's discomfort shows up, it isn't necessarily a sign that you're on the wrong path. Sometimes it's just a sign that the path is new enough to bother people used to the old one. In A Confession, Tolstoy actually maps out, with almost clinical clarity, the paths he observed in the people around him when they were confronted with that same sense of emptiness. The first path is simply not noticing. Most people, according to him, go through their entire lives distracted enough to never face the question head-on, too busy with tasks, obligations, and small urgencies to let the necessary silence appear. It looks like peace. It works like a well-administered anesthetic. He calls the second path immediate pleasure. Since life has no guaranteed meaning, at least enjoy it with as much pleasure as possible while it lasts, without worrying about the big questions. It's a common, seductive answer, and Tolstoy admits he'd lived part of his own youth exactly that way, through gambling, drinking, and excess, before the crisis deepened enough for that exit to stop working. Of the 4 paths he mapped out, there's one he himself came dangerously close to choosing. Which one do you think it was? The third path, the most radical, is ending it all at once, which he describes, disturbingly, as the most logically consistent answer for anyone who's concluded that life truly has no meaning at all and has enough intellectual courage to act on that conclusion all the way through. It's the answer the opening question already gave away. The reason he removed from his home everything that could be used against his own life during the most acute period of his crisis. And there's a fourth path, which he simply calls weakness, continuing to live, even while knowing, even while feeling the whole emptiness, without the courage for the extreme of ending it all, and without being able to numb yourself back through pleasure or distraction. Living trapped between clarity and inertia, dragging the days out with no answer and no visible way out. Tolstoy admits this was exactly the state he stayed in the longest, the most common one among the cultured, reflective people around him, and also, without question, the most quietly exhausting of the 4. It was only by watching the peasants, their simple faith and their direct relationship with work and death, that he found what he considered a 5th path, never described before with this kind of weight. Living not despite the question of meaning, but through a practical answer built day by day, through consistent action, simple ethics, and genuine connection, even without ever fully solving the bigger mystery behind it. Far from the perfect philosophical certainty he'd been chasing since he was young, but enough to keep standing, with his eyes open. It's worth stopping and honestly recognizing which of these paths best describes your own life right now. Maybe it's the first one, constant distraction, full of tasks that fill up the day without leaving room for the question to surface. Maybe it's the second, an almost compulsive search for immediate pleasure, entertainment, consumption, anything that muffles the silence for a few more minutes. Maybe it's the fourth, the quietest of all, living fully aware of the emptiness, without the courage to change, and without the ability to forget. None of these answers is anything to be ashamed of. According to Tolstoy himself, they're practically universal. What changes everything isn't recognizing which path you're on. It's deciding whether you're going to stay on it by choice or just by inertia. That is, deep down, the only distinction that really matters after everything in this story. Inertia and choice can look, from the outside, like exactly the same thing, the same routine, the same job, the same relationship, the same house, but on the inside, they're completely different experiences to live through. Inertia erodes slowly, without the person even noticing, until one day, like Ivan Ilyich, they look back and don't recognize their own decisions. A conscious choice, even when it results in the exact same external life, completely changes the internal weight of living it. The real question was never, what should I do with my life? It was always this: is this life yours, or is it just what was left over after you stopped asking? Go back, one last time, to that crisis hidden away in his room at 50 years old, at the height of his fame, and compare it to the final image, decades later, of an 82-year-old man, sick, lying in an unfamiliar train station house, who had still chosen, on his own 2 feet, to walk out of his house in the dead of night, in pursuit of something more consistent with what he believed. Between those 2 images lies an entire lifetime of trying, failing, relapsing, and rebuilding. He didn't arrive at the end perfect. He arrived honest, which, looking back, might be the only reasonable goal for anyone willing to seriously ask this question. No real story ends with every conflict resolved and a perfect bow tied at the finish. Tolstoy's ends at a train station, with a wife waiting outside a closed door, with children split between different loyalties, with a massive literary legacy sitting right alongside personal contradictions he never fully resolved. And yet, it's exactly that imperfection that makes the message trustworthy. He's not selling some easy formula for inner peace. He's showing, with his own life as proof, that the question is worth asking even without any guarantee of a clean answer at the end. Maybe the greatest generosity Tolstoy's story offers is this: it takes the pressure off having to find a definitive answer before you start acting. He spent decades without fully resolving his own anguish, and still managed to write some of the most important books in the history of literature, influence movements that changed entire countries, and, by his own standards, live more in line with what he believed during his final years than he had during his entire youth. Progress didn't require absolute certainty. It only required the willingness to keep asking, even uncomfortably, even without any guarantee. It's easy to wait for total clarity before changing anything in your own life. In practice, that wait tends to last forever, because total clarity rarely arrives before the action. It usually arrives afterward, as a consequence of having acted despite the doubt. Ivan Ilyich waited until his deathbed. Tolstoy, at least, got the chance to act while he was still alive, imperfectly, late, against the resistance of the people around him, but still in time to make a real difference in how he spent his final years. In the end, the question that opened this video is exactly where it was. Does the idea that there's freedom in living by conviction actually survive when it's tested to its limit? Tolstoy didn't leave a neat, closed answer to that question, and maybe no closed answer really exists. What he left behind was proof, lived out in his own skin, that the idea is worth testing anyway, facing it head-on instead of pushing it off for later, for whenever there's time. You have right now the same test he only accepted decades after he was already too exhausted to keep running from it. There's no right age to start asking this question, no perfect moment waiting somewhere in the future. There's only today, with the same old routine, with the same old choices, and the possibility, still fully intact, of looking at them with different eyes. That doesn't solve the emptiness once and for all, but it's the first real step, the only one that any person anywhere in the world has complete control to take right now without waiting for anyone's permission. If this reflection meant something to you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because that helps this kind of content reach more people who are also, without realizing it, in need of hearing this same question. And if you want to go beyond this video, dig deeper into these ideas, and keep practicing this kind of philosophy applied to real life alongside other people on this same search, consider joining the channel's membership club. The space built exactly for people who don't just want to watch, they want to practice.